What a really wonderful turnout. My name is Lisa Henderson. I'm the new dean, starting just this past January, of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, and it is a real pleasure to introduce the afternoon's event, although Jeremy Copeland will introduce Randy Richmond, this afternoon's speaker. I love seeing someone whom I recognize from a poster. First, our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Western University is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Arawandran peoples, all of whom have had long-standing relationships to the land of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The First Nation communities of our local area include Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. And in our region, there are 11 First Nations communities, as well as a growing Indigenous urban population. Western University values the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original peoples of Turtle Island, which many of us also know as North America. The land acknowledgement is still moving to me. It gives me great pleasure, and it's an honor to start an occasion with that acknowledgement and to follow with the pleasure of introducing the Clissold Lecture, though as I mentioned, Jeremy will introduce our speaker. I heard Randy Richmond's lecture, or brief interview, very lively interview on CBC London this afternoon, so I know that we're all in for a treat. And I also wanted to acknowledge that in honor of Randy's talk, a member of the Clissold family this afternoon made a contribution to FIMS. So we have you to thank for that as well. As many of you will already know, the Clissold Lecture commemorates the life and the work of Edward Clissold, who lived from 1833 to 1915, one of London's most important early editors and journalists. Edward retired as editor of the London, Ontario Advertiser after 33 years on staff. We've had a number of wonderful speakers, and it keeps getting better, so please help me welcome Jeremy Copeland, who will in turn introduce Randy Richmond.
Thank you, Lisa, and thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I want to start by putting into context what Randy Richmond accomplished when the London Free Press won the highest award in journalism in Canada 2 years ago. The last time the London Free Press won that award, the Michener Award, was way back in 1975. And it usually goes to the Globe and Mail, CBC, Toronto Star, bigger news organizations. I first met Randy about 10 years ago, not through journalism, but through ball hockey, of all things. Randy usually plays defense. I'm a forward. I much prefer having Randy play on my team, I'll say. He's very tough to play against. He's tenacious. He stands his ground. And even though he's no longer the fastest person in the gym, the guy in the back there probably gets that award most nights, he's still incredibly hard to get around. And Randy brings that determination and that work ethic to his reporting. And I remember when he was working on the Jamie High story, which won the Michener Award, he'd work weekends, late at night, he would take sick days and even vacation days just to work on that story, to work on a story that he cared about so much and was close to his heart. Investigative journalism plays an important role in our communities, a critical role in our communities. It can spark change, as Randy's story did. It can make us, our families, and our friends safer. But it takes a lot of time and resources to do that. And in shrinking newsrooms, in newsrooms where budgets are being cut all the time, there are less and less Canadians who are doing investigative journalism here in Canada. And that means fewer journalists are doing the important work that Randy does, giving a voice to the voiceless and holding power to account. Today, Randy's going to talk about his award-winning series. His reporting led to changes in our correctional systems, our criminal systems, and our mental health care systems as well. He's going to talk about the challenges of doing investigative journalism in smaller newsrooms, which is happening all across the country, as well as talk about what you can do to help support investigative journalism. Quick recap of his career. Randy started in Orillia, a town about 2 hours north of Toronto, at the Orillia Times and Packet, where he's a reporter. When he was offered a job at the London Free Press, him and his wife Janice, who's here tonight, moved with their 3 kids to London, and he's been a reporter there for about just over 20 years now. During that time, Randy has won 15 provincial newspaper awards. He's been nominated for 5 National Newspaper Awards and, of course, won the Michener Award, which is the highest award for journalism in Canada. So, it gives me great pleasure to welcome my very good friend Randy, who's also an outstanding journalist. And please join me in giving Randy a warm reception. Have fun.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for that great introduction. It was not fake news. It was mostly real. And to you and to Romaine Smith-Fullerton, Dean Lisa Henderson, the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, for inviting me here, to Aaron Carroll and the tech crew for arranging this. I also want to thank Becky Blue, Ella Young, Pamela McKenzie, and Sharon Waters. I don't know what they do here besides harassing me the past few weeks and making sure I showed up at the right place at the right time with notes and slideshow. It was like having 4 more editors in my life, but I still appreciate it. Thank you very much. I went to Carleton University for journalism school, and whatever successes I've had as a journalist, they only contact me when they want money. So it's an honor and pleasure to speak here, to be here without paying for it. I really appreciate it. The reason I'm here today is in mid-2015, about May or June, I spent about $100 and got an audio recording and a transcript from a court hearing that passed December 2014 in St. Thomas, Ontario. So I sat at my desk one day and I listened to the audio recording and read along. And a few minutes in, I swore. I won't say the word. I jumped out of my chair and I walked out of the newsroom. And I walked past our offices full of empty desks and then other empty offices, and I'll get back to that later. And I kept repeating that word in my head over and over and over again. I was horrified. On that tape, I heard in a man's voice the disintegration of his mind. I heard court officials who were scrambling to find solutions. I heard correctional officers frustrated and angry. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So on the transcript, I saw the word that I knew would be the title of anything I wrote. So there's somewhere, Mr. High, Indiscernible. And in that moment, when I listened to that tape, I knew the first word, the point of that story. And I wanted the story to start as an instruction, maybe even a command. And I'll just read it out because it's exactly what I wanted people to do. I just want to start off with saying, listen. He's trying to say something. He's taking the thoughts in his head and he's dragging them into his mouth and working them around on his tongue to get them out in the right order, but they keep tumbling and mumbling out and no one can understand the words. Tonight I want to tell you a story about the man behind that voice I heard that day, how he went from a perfect life to death on the floor of a jail cell. As Jeremy said, I'm going to tell you some of the steps I took to follow that story. I'm going to talk about the challenges of doing that story and other investigative work in newsrooms that are shrinking. And I'm going to tell you how it can be done still, and I think it can be done even better, and of course why it must be done. And the story goes back to December 2014, I think it was December 23rd. A scanner call came over in the newsroom. VSA, vital signs absence at EMDC, Elgin Middlesex Detention Centre. That's the provincial jail in London, Ontario. A little while later came a news release and the usual statement of sympathy from the corrections minister at the time. I mean, even then we had a pattern for jail stories for deaths. And at the time, that was the 5th death there since 2009. And it's worth noting now we're up to 14. So although this story made some improvements at the jail, there's still lots to be done. The story didn't say much. No name, sort of the basics, a bit of background. And Christmas was coming, so we all went off on our holidays, and I never saw a second story with this person's name in it again until I wrote about it. A few weeks, I got back from Christmas holidays, which in the newspaper is about a day or two. I came back, and I had a name and a small photo from a real estate brochure. Name is Jamie High. So the first thing I had to do, and the first step always when you're trying to do an investigation, is find people. Find people who know him. People, of course, give you the narrative of what happened in his life. They can become the guides on the path that you're following. And I know there's different ways of doing investigative journalism. Some start with data, some start with this. I always start with people, just what I'm comfortable with. And I wanted people who had a stake in what happened to Jeremy and who weren't happy about it. And one of the first people I came across was Angie High. And that was his estranged wife. As a girl, she grew up in the same town as he did, the same small town, married him, had 2 children. She kind of gave me the beginning of his story, his life before things fell apart. After that, I found a woman named Julie Ferguson. After Jamie's marriage fell apart, he moved in with Julie Ferguson. She was kind of like the center of the story. She was, their conflict sort of started the fall towards the end, and a very important person to talk to as well. And I found his friend, Dylan Eldred, a very good friend of his. And Dylan was with him almost to the end. And because of that, he could kind of tell me the end of the story. And he was one of the key drivers in wanting the story to get out. They were all upset about what happened. They, at first, to be honest, all pointed fingers at each other a bit. By the end of it, I don't know if they did, but of course that wasn't what I was trying to get at. And it seems obvious, but you need to know as much about the person as you can. It's the only way you're going to begin to see what happened, how far they fell, is knowing who they were. So I wanted to find out more about Jamie, and this is one of my mantras of journalism, regardless of investigative or not, is you need to go where the story lives. And that's me, way back at the Aurelia paper, 1990s, and kind of a mullet, but whatever. Whoops, I lost my mic. And I put this photo up because in the 1990s in Aurelia, they were going to build an incinerator to burn waste and turn it into energy. And my paper, which was a Thompson paper at the time, gave myself and a reporter $700 for gas and food to go down to Indianapolis for a week to look at this incinerator. And the whole point about the incinerator was that it would burn so cleanly that there'd be nothing left but beautiful fine ash. So we went down to Indianapolis and talked to the officials and talked to some people, and then we drove out to the ash site. And my friend and colleague took a picture of myself, and that's a bit of carpet. There's all kinds of chunks of things in the ash. We got back to Aurelia, we put that in the paper. The controversy blew up even more. People said it's not clean burning. City Council eventually voted it down. That's just one small example of where you go to where the story lives, and good things will happen. And in Jamie's case, I went to Dunnville, which is home of the Mudcat. I think it's Mudcat Muddy. Dunnville is a great place, a beautiful little town, about 5,000 people. And it sits on the Grand River just as it widens before it gets to Lake Erie. And of course, they have an annual catfish festival. They call their hockey teams the Mudcats. A great place. It's kind of like living to be like kind of Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer. There's lots of fishing, there's boats. Kids play baseball, they play hockey. It's a pretty town, and I wandered around the town. I went there 3 times on different days. You know, I looked at the house where he grew up. I went by his high school. I went to the library and read the newspapers there for about the 10 years he grew up. I wanted to see what life was like there, and it was very small town. It was the 70s everywhere else, but it was like the 50s and 60s in Dunnville. I went through and went to the high school yearbooks, and I found a picture of Angie Hunter, she was the name, and Jamie High. They're about a year apart. I think they dated briefly in high school. But I just got a sense of what they were like looking at their pictures. They both were in sports. I mean, she was queen of the prom one year. He was the athletic hockey player. And you know, I got a sense that everybody knew Jamie. And everybody said that. Everybody I talked to said everybody knew Jamie. After they got out of school, they went their different ways, and they met in Dunnville later at, I think it was the Mudcat Festival. And they got together, they got married, they started building a life together. Jamie became a commercial real estate agent, very successful. And I went sort of everywhere where he went. I went by the cottage they had. I got pictures of the boats that they owned. I just want to know everything about him. And I later on went to his house, and I never took a picture of his house because Angie asked me not to. But I noticed on the top of it, there was a plaque over the big front door that says, "Some days are diamonds." And they really were for Jamie. Like, this is classic Jamie. All his friends call this photo classic Jamie. He had a great life. You know, here he is. They love about this photo, what I love too, is he's sitting there after a hockey game. I think it's every Friday in St. Thomas. These guys dress up in Boston Bruin uniforms with the old names on it and Philadelphia Flyers, and they play hockey. And of course, afterwards, you know, you can see he's got a beer beside him and a cell phone in his hand. He's obviously making a joke or taking a joke, a big smile on his face. Life was good. He was making multi-million-dollar deals. Everything was going great. But I looked up there's a song, "Some Days Are Diamonds." There's a couple songs with those lines in them. And one of the lines afterwards, of course, is "Some days are stones." Obviously, I used that in the story because the days turned to stones for him. His marriage with Angie fell apart. He moved in with Julie Ferguson. He and Julie argued one night. This would be about September 2014. He drove away. Police were called. Police caught up to him, and he was arrested first for refusing to give a breath sample. Police called Angie, his estranged wife, and said, "We're going to bring him back here," because that was the address they had. And she said, "Oh, no, don't." And they said, "Why?" And she said, "Because he pushed me." So at that moment, he was then arrested for domestic violence. So he entered the justice system, and, you know, boom, all his problems really started then. All those institutions he was about to go through that were supposed to help him, all they did was hurt him. He was arrested, and he was put in jail. He had no record, and the conviction, if he didn't be convicted of both charges, he would not have spent time in jail. The Crown had already said that. So, but still, nonetheless, he's thrown in jail. And while he's in jail, he has to wait for a surety. And a surety is someone that pays some money up front and agrees to supervise you. And sure enough, eventually he got out, and eventually his surety became Julie, the same woman he fought with. And that made no sense to me at all. I didn't even know at that point how messy the bail system in Ontario was. So I took that kind of traditional next step that you do in investigations, and I just started reading reports. That's about a quarter of all the reports I read. I read reports on bail. I read reports on mental health and police. I read reports on how domestic violence, people accused of domestic violence are handled. I realized I had to look more at like every report, community health care in the community, what hospitals are supposed to do with accused people. And you know, when you're doing investigative work, there are lots of researchers out there who've done the work for you. They've talked to people, they've done studies, they know where the gaps in the system are. All you have to do is borrow it and see if it applies to your situation. And I just kept looking, and the more steps he took, the more steps I had to take, because he tumbled through so many different systems. A few months after he got out of jail, Julie, remember, is his surety, the one supervising him, they fought. And that meant, she kicked him out, and that meant technically he was now a criminal because his surety had withdrawn her surety. He had no place to go. So we ran off and stayed in this little motel in St. Thomas, nearby where he was living with Julie. And of course I went to that motel, and the kind motel owner let me in, and it was, you know, it wasn't a 5-star. It was what you'd expect. It was older, and it was right near a gas station. And that's where he spent a couple nights, and he was in a panic. I mean, he's basically breaking the law. He's got nowhere to go. At that, one of the days he was there, he was handed divorce papers from a lawyer from his wife. It's a horrible moment in his life. His friend Dylan, remember Dylan Eldred, found him in the motel. He was a mess. He was incoherent. Normally, you know, well put together Jamie High is in shambles. He's wearing clothes that are stinky. He hasn't washed or showered in days. So Dylan, thinking he's doing the right thing, and he was, takes him into the St. Thomas Elgin General Hospital. where after being assessed, Jamie is checked in. He's admitted to hospital. He's going to get the best care there. They've got all kinds of great things in their mental health unit. It's a brand new unit. And he's going to see a psychiatrist. He's got a mental health nurse. Dylan leaves him about 11:30 midnight thinking, my friend is safe and sound. Things are good. Somehow, though, police find out he's there, the St. Thomas police. And because he'd lost his surety, they now had a reason to arrest him. And they did. They yanked him out at 1 o'clock in the morning and took him to the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. And imagine if you're fighting all this pressure, all this stress, you know, your life is falling apart, you need help, and they take you here. That's a segregation cell at Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. It's got to be the worst place in the world for anybody struggling. It's a terrible place for anybody. But I mean, it's been proven time and time again, if you've got a mental illness or addiction, it's terrible. That's a concrete bed. You can see it. It's peeling away. Toilet, sink. Some have windows, some do not. And you're there for, at best, 23 hours a day. You get out to make a phone call sometimes. And it's down a long hallway, and you get your food through a food tray. It's just terrible. So that's where he ends up. He goes to court a couple of days later. We're now up to December 23rd when I get the hearing. And that's when he goes to court. And the justice of the peace doesn't know what to do with him. And he's not in court, he's in a video room at Elgin Middlesex Detention Center. He's wrapped under a big, heavy suicide gown, basically, to protect himself. He can't walk, he's in a wheelchair. He's just mumbling, he's incoherent. But nobody could do anything with him. Nobody knew what to do. They thought if they sent him back, he'd be okay. They thought, well, we'll bring him back here the next day and try to get him another surety, get him out. So they sent him back. And he spiraled downhill quickly, and he died. They found him naked on the cell floor. He died of delirium due to alcohol withdrawal. And it was untreated because it was undiagnosed, because it's a jail. It's not a hospital. And they really didn't know what was happening. So I had that story from narratives, from reports. I knew there were some problems. But what I needed next was sort of that holy grail of investigative journalism. I needed documents, I needed records. So I did the usual. I sent out freedom of information requests. Most of them got turned away. The hospital said no, police said no. The Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services delayed and delayed. And when you do these reports, the first thing that comes back is it's going to cost $10,000. And you say, no, it's not. And then it ends up costing $100 or $200 or $1,000, but they always try to stall the system. So I needed a person, and I needed this person, Lisa Gunn. She's a lawyer in St. Thomas, and is the lawyer for Angie High and his estate. Lisa Gunn hates publicity. It took months to get her to pose for a photograph. But she agreed to talk to me because she felt so strongly that so many things had gone so wrong. Even in the justice system that she belongs to, even among the lawyers that she's part of, she thought there was something that went wrong here. So she helped me open a lot of doors to records. So I got hospital records. That's Jamie's hospital record. I got community health care records. I got some jail logs. She was a little unhappy about letting me see too much of that. I saw the coroner's report. I saw all kinds of records, and it confirmed that a lot of things went wrong. It gave me kind of a minute-by-minute account of what things went wrong. And with that information, I went back to the hospital, I went back to the police, I went back to the legal community, I went back to the ministry and said, what's happening? What happened here? And mostly because of our privacy laws, I got nothing back. I just can't comment, can't comment, can't comment. I think I had in the story 23 questions or 33 questions for St. Thomas police officers. And I think I got one or two answers from the direct questions. But I had a good idea about where the systems failed. I had a good idea where the institutions failed. I think I have, and had a good idea who Jamie High was. I had a pretty complete narrative of his downfall. So I had the story, which was in brief an ordinary person with an ordinary life, actually a person with a better than ordinary life, you know, big house, wife, kids, boats, cottages, 2 cottages, somehow ended up in police control, failed by community mental health, ends up in a jail, psychiatric hospital, court, back to jail again. Everybody failed him. So I filed a series. Well, I actually filed it several times. I'll get to that in a minute. Called Indiscernible. And it was 8 parts, online and in print. It had videos and photographs. And it landed online in October 2016. And it's probably the longest story the Free Press has ever done. And I'm proud of that, because that's kind of what I'm known for, is long-form journalism. And that word, of course, was a word that was used throughout the court proceedings when the court transcriptionist could not understand what he said. Whenever his words were too mumbled, she would write down indiscernible. And because I work in a newsroom full of respect, it got nicknamed quickly Indecipherable, which I guess for being that long, it could have been named that. But there was, you know, aside from the joking about the newsroom, there were a lot of pressures, and it was because of the newsroom that I was able to withstand some of those pressures. I mean, it sounds very straightforward now. I did some work, I dug up some reports, I talked to some people, but it wasn't then, and investigative journalism never is. And the pressures of a small newsroom make it difficult, but there are benefits as well, which I'll get to as well. Remember I talked about those empty desks. This was after one of our annual Christmas time layoffs or buyouts. It's stabilized for now, but at the time there was a lot of empty desks, a lot of people leaving. And you know, in lots of places, and it could happen in our place too, that shovel is going to get smaller. The newsrooms are going to get smaller. And so the biggest pressure I had, of course, is time. I mean, there's only so much time to do investigative work in any newsroom, and in a small one, there's even less time. I mean, we have to do daily work. There has to be daily newspaper. There has to be online presence. And this took so long to do. It took me a month just to get his name and make the first calls to his friends. It took about 6 weeks to make contact with Lisa Gunn, the first contact, and she didn't go on record for probably a year. A couple months before I got the recording and the transcript. And it took 6 months to persuade Angie to talk on the record. That's his estranged wife. And it took almost a year of phone calls and emails to get his other family to talk. And I had to sit down in a meeting with them, a horribly sad meeting for several hours, just to get them to agree to release a statement later. It took more than a year to get the FOI results back, which said hardly anything, sad to say. And about the same time to get the hospital records and the jail records and the coroner's report. And, you know, all the time I'm interviewing people, I'm heading to Dunnville, I'm reading reports, you know, I'm doing all this, and I still had to contribute now and then. I counted my bylines, and figured 20 months this whole thing took from the hardcore start to finish. And with the holidays out, I had 284 bylines, or about 3 stories a week. Well, it's a daily newspaper. That's not really good enough for a daily newspaper. And I wrote, but still I had to do it while I was doing this, and I wrote 6 different versions of the 8 stories each. So I have a little file folder on my desktop that's got version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, so on. And I talk about this in the story, but it became known as Jail Guy on our daily skeds. It'd be Randy, Jail Guy, Randy, Jail Guy. So everybody else is doing things for the next day. Mine says Jail Guy. And you know, that went on for so long that people just stopped asking what it was about. They forgot, which was a good thing for me because I didn't want to really talk about it. And I was starting, feel a bit guilty about it as well. And, nowadays, we've got the website. And so we have even more pressures than we had in the past. We're supposed to be 24/7 online, which we can't quite accomplish. And we're supposed to do it with smaller numbers than the newspapers had 10 years ago. So it's no longer are you just filing a story once a day. You're filing web hits, web updates, all through the day. So we've got that pressure on us too in a small newsroom now. And we've also got this great pressure to tweet all the time, to do Facebook updates, do Facebook Live, which I always mess up. We're supposed to do video all the time. We're supposed to have them on YouTube. So, there's all this pressure all this time to do more and more and more. And there's also a lot of pressure because of money. Investigative journalism takes money. It's not just the staff time you're losing. Everything costs, and lawyers cost a lot. And every time you do a story like this, you have to have it lawyered, as we say, and that's one cost. This was not an expensive series, but I still had to travel. Dunnville, I still had to buy transcripts, I had to buy records. The FOIs, I can't remember how much it cost. Actually, it was very reduced because they took so long and they messed up. But usually they're very, very expensive. And when you're finally done, and you got everything done, and you're, oh, it's happy. I got everything done, and you get the worst problem besides time, which is space. And I asked my editors, that's all I want. I don't want a raise, I want time and space. And the first time I threw, I don't know how many pages, a lot of pages, on my editor-in-chief, Joe Ricetti's desk. First reaction, it's too long, no one's gonna read it. And he might be right about the last part, but that was our battle for months and months. It's too long, it's too long, it's too long. And that front page story there, that part of it, I don't know, what's that, 100 words, maybe 200 words, that city politicians backing back to the river. Well, I threw 25,000 words on his desk. So you can imagine an editor's horror when they see that and think, what am I gonna do? Well, with today's paper, that's like so many pages. I can't even count how many pages that would be in today's paper. And of course, there's supposed to be art with it, which I think is a waste of space myself. I want room for the words. So I actually was very, very depressed about it. And I talked to Jeremy Copeland one day over a beer, and he said, don't worry, the web is limitless. You go in there and tell Joe Riccetti just to run it. The whole thing online. So I sort of did, not quite as direct as Jeremy suggested, and they did run most of it online. I still had to cut the stories, some of them in half, for print, but we managed to get it in. And that pressure will grow in some ways as papers get smaller, but I'm hoping that the web will take more and more long form. Editors, though, still don't like to read a lot, so you still got that battle. I've handed in stories since, and I've gotten the same reaction, it's too long. I handed a story the other day, and I actually prefaced it with the conversation my editor and I would have, and I said, you're gonna say this, and I'm gonna say this, and you're gonna say this, and I'm gonna say this, and you're gonna say it's too long. And I'm gonna say, put it online, and that's exactly what happened. And with all the money and time I was spending, of course, there's that other pressure when you do investigative journalism, and that failure. And that was me, constantly, all the time. More than once I thought this might turn into like a little news brief. You know, a man named Jamie Hyde died in jail, and we couldn't find anything else about him. That was it. You lie awake in bed at night thinking, what am I doing? This is taking too long. If this doesn't work out, my name is mud in the newsroom. And I've had many failures in investigative journalism. I'm sure anybody has. I counted 4 folders on my laptop of incomplete investigations. And sometimes it was, I just couldn't get what I wanted out of the freedom of information. Sometimes the people didn't talk. I came very close to some very good series, and they're not going to happen. And when you take time and money to do that, that costs a lot for a newspaper organization. And you're wasting all that time in a small newsroom. While I was doing this, the colleagues around me were working harder to fill the space. I'm going to Dunnville and I'm pretending I'm Huck Finn, and they're running around chasing ambulances and going to court and everything. So when I talked about the 280 bylines I had, well, they had 400 and more during that same time period. And they were working hard so I could do this. So, that's where the guilt came in. And that's when I would sometimes call in sick and work so it didn't look so bad. I felt it was better to call in sick than to go in and work on this because I didn't want to look bad to my colleagues. I'm sure they wouldn't have minded, but I mean, the staffing levels have a huge pressure on smaller newsrooms, especially when you're doing long-form investigative journalism. I want to show you a slide here. That is the 2016 Hillman Awards Honorable Mention team. The Hillman Awards are given out yearly for investigative work about injustices that lead to change. This year, 2016, this didn't even win it, was a joint project of CBC Aboriginal Site and the CBC Manitoba Investigative Unit. And it was about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Great project. But there's 17 faces here. There's a managing editor, a project manager, 4 designers, 2 copy editors, 1 photo editor, 2 reporters, and 6 writer-researchers. So I had 9 reporter-writer-researchers in my newsroom total when I was doing this story. So you can see how hard it is to do investigative work. And I'll show you the team we had. That's the Michener team. I did the reporting, but it's a team award. That's Joe Riccitti, the guy I talk about a lot. Greg Van Morsel, Kate Dubinsky, who's here. Maurice Lamont, Ian Gillespie, and our designer, Juanita Sims. Kate did the digital, Maurice did the photos, and Ian did the copy editing. I had a picture of myself in there, but it didn't fit. And most of these people here were thrown at it at the last month or so, and they had to deal with it while doing their regular jobs. And I love this photo, except for Juanita kind of ruins it, because we're all in white. And at the time, we were run by Sun Media, the Toronto Sun, and we all had to wear white shirts for our photos. I guess we weren't white enough for the sun. Had to make us whiter somehow. That was the culture at the time. It's a different culture now. Actually, the Free Press has always had its own culture. And that is kind of leading into what I think is some of the ways that we can still do it with small newsrooms. And culture. It's kind of my second most important thing. You know, the Free Press and Post Media, who runs this now, we like success. We've had probably a dozen National Newspaper Award nominations in the past, 5, 6 years. We've won dozens and dozens of Ontario Newspaper Awards for everything from spot news to opinion to multimedia, you name it. We like to compete against our peers, some of them here from CBC. We like to win, we like to get scoops, and we like to have impact. Twice now in the past 4 years, we've won or been nominated for the Canadian Journalism Foundation Jackman Award of Excellence for reporting. That's for reporting that has impact. We've been to the Michener 3 times since I've been there, twice for citations and once for the award. And I wanted to show you what that means, and I also want to do this so that I can keep doing my job. So there's Joe Riccitti with Governor General Adrian Clarkson for a Michener citation in 2002 for exposing secret overtime payments, sexual harassment scandals, and the takeover by management. There's Joe Riccitti with another Governor General, Michelle Jean, in 2008 for coverage of lead pipes in the city that turned out to be a risk to everybody. And there's Joe with the recent one in 2017 for the Indiscernible series. And they are a team award for a newsroom. And the advantage that a small newsroom can have is that the culture can dominate it. It can infiltrate everywhere. It can be the culture at times. And that leads to a lot of excellent investigative, sort of on-the-fly investigative journalism that we can do in between other stories. And small newsrooms can excel at that. But there's going to be more attacks, of course, on the culture as newsrooms shrink, web demands rise, and advertisers and advertising salespeople find new insidious ways to get their content in the paper. And I think, though, that new journalists are going to bring new skills that will balance that. And I think one of the main skills that new journalists are going to bring is data journalism. This was my attempt at data journalism for this series, and it looks pretty good. I think Kate might have done that. I went and looked at 61 inquests of jail deaths I think way back, and I found the percentage that recommended different kinds of concerns. The point was that if you have 20 years of jail inquests that show the same recommendations, obviously nothing's changing. 44% recommended changes, how people should be treated for physical problems, and on and on. Well, I did that with my great data journalism skills. I took all the 61 inquests and I printed them out, and I took colored highlighters and I marked down each category: mental health concerns, addiction concerns, on and on and on. It took a couple days. Then I counted them all up on another piece of paper by hand. I used a calculator to figure out the percentage, so that's something high tech for me. And of course, it worked, but it wasn't the best way to do it. And I know there are young journalists at this faculty who could come in and do it better, more completely and faster. And I think that's going to be one of the ways, besides culture, that we can sustain this investigative journalism. I think, though, as well, though, that small newsrooms, maybe the Free Press, maybe CBC London, maybe the other ones, Blackburn and the rest, 90, 1290, if they want to do investigative journalism, they're going to have to change their focus. We're expected still to be everything for everybody, newspapers and radio stations, television, digital, and I don't think we can. And I will argue in my newsroom that let's be what matters most to society, and society is not clicks, web clicks. Society needs investigative journalism. It's not going to be an easy argument, I know that, but I think that it's one that has to be made. I think that news organizations are going to have to change the focus if they want to be taken seriously. We've tried different ways at the Free Press to do this. We've tried having specialized teams. It never seems to work because we're too small and we're too fluid. We might have to go to outside organizations or collectives to get some data journalism help. It might be time for newspapers to open I keep using newspapers, but all news organizations to open the doors. I'm going to show you a slide of the Hillman Awards again. This was, I keep pumping up the Hillman Awards and they never give me anything, so maybe this will help. This was a story that explored the environmental failings of the oil and gas industry, and it had a huge impact on government policy. It's an excellent collaboration, but you'll notice that, maybe you should probably read that fast, but look at how many people there were. More importantly, there's the Toronto Star, the National Observer, Global News. I'm not sure what the corporate mapping project is, and there were 4 universities: Concordia, Ryerson, University of British Columbia, and the University of Regina. And those students helped do 400 interviews and 118 Freedom of Information requests. That's astounding power to have that at your hand, and it worked. And it's a strength that media, schools, and news organizations can bring to investigative journalism. And I think that was the Hillmans that I was there with Jeremy as a guest, again, not a nominee. And I turned to Jeremy and I said, what the heck? Isn't there a university and news organizations in London? And I'll leave that out there and let people with higher pay scales think about that for a minute. But I just want to say that, and I'm no expert in investigative journalism. You get an award and people think you are, but I do know sort of what I feel is the best way for investigative journalism to survive in small newsrooms, and that is making sure we have individual journalists with heart and commitment, and consumers, and I see consumers of news here, social justice advocates, people working for nonprofits, researchers, defense lawyers, have the same commitment for social justice and for change. Support journalism by paying for it if it investigates. Get off the things that distract you and read the serious journalism. The news holes are shrinking, people are distracted by social media, politicians are, I think, even more devious than ever at getting their messages out and avoiding us. Institutions are facing cutbacks. I mean, there's nonprofits in London that are suffering because United Way is cutting funding. There's a lot of stresses on a lot of systems, and someone has to keep an eye on that, on those stresses, point out the problems and push for change. And small newsrooms can make change. And I just want to, here's a couple of examples. Whoops, that's not the right one. That's the right one. In 2014, there was a guy named Dave McPherson who died in an unregulated group home for ex-psychiatric patients. The Free Press investigated what happened, and we concluded that, we revealed basically that healthcare workers, social service workers in the city, the Ontario Public Trustee, bylaw people, firefighters, police, all knew about the problems at these homes and other homes like it, but they turned a blind eye. We pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually, over time, we had an acknowledgement from different organizations that they messed up, and the City of London created new regulations to help protect people in these homes. That got us a national newspaper nomination for investigation work. Only in 2017, we started investigating the death of a sex worker named Josie Glenn. She died in October. She was killed in October, and a man was charged with murder. A Free Press team, and that's 2 people, basically, found 2 women who had complained to police about the same man in the spring of that year. One was a sex worker and wasn't believed at first. The other one, they believed a bit more, but the man was still let out on bail after a few months. And no one warned anybody. The police, the courts, they didn't warn worker agencies, they didn't warn the public, they didn't warn sex workers. So this guy was out, and meanwhile another sex worker died. So after our stories ran, London police changed their policy. And they started naming men accused of assaulting sex workers, and that keeps sex workers safe. So there's another good thing you can do with a small newsroom. And Jamie High, I'm not going to go into the ways changes that story prompted. It did change things in the criminal justice system. It did change things in the police and the courts in St. Thomas. It dealt with London agencies who deal with mental health issues, decided they would start accepting men who'd been accused of violence, put pressure on the province to improve health care at the jails. There was a range of impacts. And that's pretty satisfying to get recognized for your work, to get asked to speak at lectures like this. And and there's pleasure in challenging authority. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. I have a letter that I keep with me all the time. 2005, I wrote a story about a man named Dennis Costello who was dying in an AIDS hospice in London. And it was a small investigation, maybe a couple weeks, and I got a lot of flack for it. The board of the hospice posted a letter on their door and sent it to every agency they could think of, basically calling me a liar. And in the end, that board left. The executive director was fired. The hospice was fined. And it's a great place now, but I kept that letter, which calls me everything in the book, because it's kind of my, to heck with you, to put it politely, letter that I keep now and again to inspire me when I'm having trouble on investigations. And my boss, Joe Rossetti, said to me the other day, we were talking about a story, and I said, man, it feels like we just keep banging our heads. He said, yeah, it does feel like we're banging our heads, but everything else is so boring, right? Everything else we do is boring compared to it. And it's a great feeling to affect social changes. It's a great feeling to fight authority, which is odd from someone my age, but that's still how I feel. But you need more than that to sustain you, through those anxious nights, through grumpy editors who tell you everything's too long. You have to make it personal. You have to personally carry the weight of someone's life and your troubles, and you have to do your best by them. You have to be personally involved. With Jamie, I just asked the question, and I still get angry about this. How do you go from this to mumbling in this video room in Elgin Middlesex Detention Center to dying here? My story was always about Jamie and what he represented, and more about him. As I said earlier, the first series, the lines in the series, I had as soon as months and months before it ran, about 18 months before it ran. And the last ones, though, I added at the last minute, which is great for people like me when you have the web, because you can always add things at the last minute. And it was a bit of opinion for me, which is not normal. I don't like putting my opinions. I don't tweet out my opinions. I don't tweet out much at all. I'm that old school, balanced journalist. But I added the last line at the last minute, and I'll read it the last part. This is from that last story. The reason the Free Press and I have been driven to tell Jamie's story and stick with it is because he never should have had a story like this. He should have had the chance to become, at least, some guy who had some trouble once and got some help and moved on. He should have had the chance to become, again, some guy you played hockey with, or saw in a gym, or met in a bar watching football, and liked because of his cockiness, or didn't like because of his cockiness, maybe a good friend, or a business partner, maybe your brother or son or husband or ex-husband or boyfriend or ex-boyfriend or father. Jamie's last days should not have been spent naked and alone on the floor of a jail cell. His last words should not have been incoherent mutterings. He never should have had a story written about him called Indiscernible. No one should. And there was anger in those lines, I admit it. And I'm still angry about what happened to Jamie High. I was in the newsroom the other day ranting and raving about something, which my initials spell, by the way, RR, rant and rave. I get that now and then. And one of our younger reporters, Dale Crothers, had yelled out, 60 and mad. And I like that. That's my mantra now, 60 and mad. And like I said, I'm not an expert in telling you what we need to do to keep digging with this shovel that's small now and getting smaller. But I can tell you, what I know from my own experience, and I'll speak directly to journalist students here. Be patient, learn your craft at journalism schools, take your time learning. I didn't get to be a full-time reporter until I was 30. I had a few wayward years in public relations, which were valuable though. And I didn't start reporting to the Free Press till I was 41 years old. So, it can take time. But learn tricks from the old guys like me. I can take any young journalist and show them how to slip out for a coffee, come back 5 hours later after interviewing someone the editors don't know about, and make it look like nothing happened. I encourage people in it and people reading it to have a soft heart for the people who suffered, but have a hardened heart for systems that fail and people that allow this suffering. Get angry. That's my best advice. Get angry and focus the anger. I want to retire in 4 years, or if Postmedia sells us to a company that does cat videos all day, but I want to leave behind newsrooms full of angry, determined, annoying, stubborn journalists. I mean, that is the hope. Despite everything else I've said, that is the big hope. People who appreciate investigative journalism, people who do investigative journalism, you guys are the hope. That's all I have to say. Thanks. Start asking questions. In life, start asking questions of me if you want. Thanks.
Okay, we have some time for questions. I'm going to come around with a microphone if you want to ask a question. I'm going to ask you to wait for me because even though it's a small enough room, so Randy could probably hear you, we want to be able to record it. So just put up your hand if you have a question and I'll run over. Grant.
Hi, I'm Grant Campbell. Thank you so much. From a 59-year-old to a 60-year-old. I remember reading, I think it was in the book Digging Deeper, about the guy who every day on his way to his job as a journalist drove past a guy standing with a sign saying, "I was abused by a priest," and didn't realize he was driving past one of the biggest stories possible. I'm wondering, thinking about young journalists coming up, do you think there are stories that people of my age and your age are missing just because we don't have the nose for those stories? Are there stories that young journalists are likely to pick up that we're not likely to pick up?
I think so. I think so because we have missed some. And I think so because they're going to take an approach that is in some ways more clever than ours. And by that, the data, the manipulation of information that they have, they're going to have that nose for it. Are there stories? I mean, we certainly, well, here's a story that I missed. I was traveling on the Chippewas of the Thames First Nations with a friend of mine named Jody Ketchigo, and he had a bit of a breakdown, and he took me to the site, and he said, "This is where the res school was. This is where all my problems started. This is where all the problems started." And this is, a long time ago now, 15 or so years ago, and I filed that, and I went, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't do anything on res schools. I didn't really understand the context." And so I think, in general, I hope we're all getting smarter and smarter and smarter about things. There's stories out there that we're not going to get to. I think there's trauma in the world that is unexplored, that we're not investigating, and that systems that are feeding that trauma. I'm not going to tell you the stories that I'm working on at the moment, but yeah, I do believe that, But it still takes training to have that nose. I don't know if that's something we can improve upon or not. But there's stuff we're missing for sure. That's a scary story, by the way, that you told me.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much. If someone did have a story, and I think that I do, how would you suggest best framing it so that someone could see that person in the street and know that it was of value?
Well, if you have a person, that person's narrative is often the best way to frame it. Simply tell the story. For the Indiscernible, we would tell a part of the story and then put the context and the gaps at the same time. Other stories we've just done the straight narrative and gone, okay, what does this mean? If you have that narrative, if not, if you're looking at stats and figures, then you're going to have to find the people to represent those stats and figures. The Globe Mail did an excellent story this past week about people hiring contractors to get them into Canada to work, and Kathy Tomlinson, and I don't know if she started with the data first and got the people, or the people and got the data first. But if you have a narrative, you know, I would start that as your framework, and then you have to find, I mean, there's different levels of investigation, but you might have to find what institutions touched this life or didn't touch this life or didn't help, what systems failed, if any systems failed, and also if this person or persons represents a wider class of people. I don't know if that helps. You can send it to me and I won't steal it. I'll look at it. I promise.
Oh, actually, no, I have a story because it affects my life and a lot of people. So
Yeah.
I'm just looking to get it out there.
Right.
Not as a writer, as someone with some knowledge of something.
Yeah, well, for sure, but if you want to make it even more powerful and you realize it represents more than just your, not just your life, but represents more than your story, then yeah, you do need to find that other elements, otherwise it's just an autobiography with no context.
Hi, Randy. I found it really interesting when you showed that slide with all the Hillman, nominees or
Right.
winners. Do you think that we are at a point in London where news organizations and newsrooms can team up together? Because I don't know if that's been done in London, but certainly between CTV and CBC and the Free Press and 980 and 1290, we all have small newsrooms, and we all are interested in a lot of the same social justice issues. What do you think it will take for newsrooms, small local newsrooms, to team up together on stories? And are we there yet here?
Well, we do play slow pitch together. That's a start. That's going to be. So it's true. We are reporters after all, not athletes. Is it possible? Boy, you mentioned a lot of the media outlets in the city. It would be very difficult, I think, to get over the competition, but the Star and the CBC do it. Other organizations do it, and I think if there's a big enough issue in London, it's possible. I don't know how our managers would feel about it, and of course, Kate's with CBC London now, and Post Media, we have big bosses who would have to consult. I think it's an idea worth exploring. It may not be everybody all at once, but you know, I would like to think so. At times, you know, I'm a very competitive person, but at times you got to put that aside, and you got to work with other people to make things happen. And I think that as we get smaller and smaller, and if we come up with big issues, we might have to. I wouldn't mind it. I'm older now. I get angry at other people, not rivals.
Long time no see.
Speaking of baseball.
I know, speaking of baseball. I know a lot of my classmates and I are heading out on our internships starting in the next month, and some of us have never been in a newsroom before. So what is your advice for the first week in terms of pitching, talking to your editors, and just adjusting to a newsroom?
Good question. I've seen some interns come in and just get, you know, crucified over their story ideas. So make sure you have many good stories ideas, because they might come up. You might have 5 and they're going to maybe like 1. Have some story ideas. Just you know, get along for the first week. Ask questions. I mean, Shannon did it in our newsroom. I mean, you did it well, right? You walk in, you have some story ideas, and you're willing to do anything. And in a lot of these small newsrooms like ours, when you come in as an intern now in the summer, you're going to do everything. You're going to do hard news, feature news, sports. You might help on investigations, if we ever got our acts together. So have the story ideas. Don't pitch them in a soft voice. Be bold. I mean, the editors are often, no offense to editors here and producers, and myself, old guys. And there's a culture of that old Lou Grant show, and it's terrible culture when it gets too excessive, but they don't have time to hear soft pitches. They want good hard pitches. And you know what, run them by some people. I don't know where Jeremy got to. Run them by Jeremy. Run them by your instructors and profs before you go in. And you'll be fine. You'll just go in and just be a normal human being. And don't be afraid to hear swearing and people yelling.
I can say this because I know you and you'll all be fantastic. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Randy, and thank Kate Dubinsky as well for throwing out this idea of some cooperative work. It's actually, I think, a pretty risky and tough thing to do for either of you to say something like that. I think it's pretty easy for those of us who teach to think about ways in which we could work more cooperatively, but I'm sure that both the students and the faculty here would be interested in figuring out ways that we can all do our jobs better, and the idea for cooperation is really terrific. So thank you both for mentioning that.
As long as we get to publish it online first, I think things will be fine. That it?
Am I looking around? Yeah.
Then I want to, after this, kind of point out a student here when I'm done.
Hi there. As somebody who's only been a journalist maybe professionally for 2 years, you've been a journalist for 2 decades. I'm curious to ask you, has hostility to journalists always been as bad as it is now? Because as somebody who has to talk to people on the phone often after hours about them being upset and calling me the fake news, I was just wondering, I get a sense that it's always been like this, but then there are things that sometimes make me think it's worse now in terms of hostility from the general public to reporters. So I was interested in getting your perspective on that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's slightly worse. We're not at the American level yet. I mean, there's always been hostility. But the whole, they have slogans like fake news, right? And they have Twitter where they can reinforce, and social media reinforce themselves and get stronger and stronger. And it's shameful the way that some female journalists are treated these days. So I think it is slightly worse. I guess I'm kind of immune to it because I just expect it now. But yeah, it might be getting worse, and it's certainly something that, well, actually, our newsroom just had a session on dealing with it, which has never happened before. So it's a sign things are getting worse. We just had a seminar about how to keep safe in public spaces, how to de-escalate, all these things you never had to do before. So I guess that does answer your question. I guess it is. And I just want to point out, I meant to mention something about how we can do things differently. And Thomas over there I was in a class that I taught a few weeks ago, and he actually said, I started reading your series, but man, it's long. And he asked me if I could put it in a podcast. And I meant to bring that up, that's kind of another way that we can start doing some investigative journalism using different formats so that we don't have these big tomes to look at. Even though Kate and others tried to break it up, it still was a lot of words. And so there might be other ways to do it. And I think that when he asked me that question, he gave me the idea that, yeah, young journalists are going to have different ways to approach things and keep the faith alive.
Hi, and thank you very much. I have a question. I haven't read Indiscernible yet, but I'm going to soon. It won't be too long. I'm of a generation for which nothing is too long to read, at least yet. But one of the arc of Jamie Hy's story, not only your story about him, is from a good life to a bad life, or a good life to an end that his life wouldn't have predicted. But then there are all kinds of people in the world who start in rough shape and who end in rough shape. And I wondered if when you were composing Indiscernible, if you were, it sounds like you were thinking about how do you go from here to here? And the implication of that story for me is how do you start in rough shape and end in rough shape, and who's writing that story when there isn't the kind of change that you want in a story? And did Indiscernible raise that question for readers? What raised that question for the press?
Definitely, and that was one of the selling points for when I went to the story with my editor was, and I have written stories about the people who start with a hard life and end up at the hard ending in jail. Like I say, there were 5 deaths, and now I've written stories about 8 or 9 others, and they were not Jamie Hy's. They were people whose childhoods were filled with trauma and abuse and addiction, and they never got out, or they tried to get out and they couldn't get out enough. But you're right, it was kind of the message I did want to send out there was is if this can happen to this guy, it can happen to anybody here, and it could, because this guy was doing well. And all it took was a little bit of being touched by different systems that are failing, and his life got worse. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yes, indeed, it was part of it, and I was hoping that that example would change things, because 99% of the people in Elgin Middlesex Detention Center and psychiatric hospitals are not going to have the advantages Jamie Hyde did. So that was one of my main points. He was kind of ordinary man for me, but extraordinary man for me. So I was trying to prove that point for sure.
Great. Well, we've run out of time for questions down here, but we're going to have a reception upstairs if anybody wants to come up. It's on the 4th floor. You're welcome to join us up there after this talk. For now, I'd just like to say and get everybody to join me in saying thank you very much to Randy for coming in and talking.
Thanks, guys.